I make a huge mistake here, and I'll explain to you guys when we get to this point in the video. The control arm swings free and the car falls off the bottle jack. Luckily nothing worse happened and I did not get hurt. Yo, what is up everybody? I hope everyone had an awesome 4th of July. I know Saturdays are usually for my Subaru videos, but I was headed out of town for the week and we were going to be driving our 2017 Nissan Rouge 18 hours to Florida. The ball joint was extremely bad and I thought it was about time to replace it before we make the long drive. I've owned this car for a little over 4 years now and I have done routine maintenance during our ownership of the vehicle and it has been super reliable. Replacing the ball joint on the Rouge was extremely shocking though. I'm a huge Nissan fan, and as a matter of fact, the Nissan 350Z happens to be one of my absolute favorite cars, and I've owned one for over 13 years. I have some really exciting videos regarding my Z coming to the channel, so make sure to subscribe if you're interested in checking that out. After I've been working on my 1998 Subaru Impreza 2.5 RS for the past 2 months, I figured this job would be a breeze, but boy was I wrong. I'll go through the video with you and explain the best I can as we continue on together and try to point out all the parts I had a difficult time with and how I was able to get the job done. The very first thing I want to point out is how difficult it was for me to get the tire off of the hub. This thing was literally frozen on there, and generally when I start kicking a tire it comes right off. But what I'm going to do here is show you exactly how bad the ball joint is, and I wanted to give you angles from behind the car. You saw me wiggling the tire and that's a big sign that it's bad, but when you have this much play in a ball joint, it's time for it to be replaced, and I try to show you every angle of that from both sides, from the front, and I even show you on top what that would look like if your wheels on and you're driving down the road. It would wobble extremely bad. The bolt that holds the ball joint to the hub assembly is an 18mm, and already we're off to a rough start. It was super tight, so I end up kicking the wrench and that breaks it free. We go ahead and zip that off just until it's at the top of the thread so I can grab my hammer and tap it in, and we do that so when we hit it with the hammer we don't really destroy the threads on the bolt. Now that it's already flushed out and we got it loose, I take the nut off and then I do lightly tap it the rest of the way out with my hammer. Once it was free, it came right out, so I grabbed it, and I also grabbed the nut and rethreaded it on the bolt. This is something that I do so you don't misplace any of the parts, and you also know what nut goes with what bolt. I grab a pry bar, and I start to just gently pry to see if we were able to pull this thing down. I wasn't sure how tight it was going to be, or if I was going to have to pry the hub open a little bit. Luckily, the pry bars were able to just bring it down with a little bit of force. I grab a socket here and I put it in between the hub and the control arm just to give me a little bit of space when I'm working with the snap ring pliers, and I also take a brass brush and I brush this down a little bit just to knock some of the rust off to see what we're working with. I grab a set of snap ring pliers, and after a few attempts I grab it and get a good hold, and we get it right over the lip of the ball joint. Now I grab my little chisel and I kind of just pry the snap ring up a little bit. Next I just grab a set of pliers and I grab the snap ring to get it out of our way. You don't want to push it back down because it will clip back on the ball joint, so you kind of just grab it and bend it up out of the way. And they do replace the snap ring with a new one. We'll get to that later on in the video. So online, and especially on YouTube, you see a lot of guys try and grab a C-clamp and press their ball joint out on the car, which this is what I was showing you is impossible. You are not able to just grab a C-clamp and use it to push the ball joint out. It just won't work. So what I end up doing is removing the control arm from the vehicle. This turned out to be way more difficult than anticipated, and this is when I started to get really frustrated doing this job. It seemed like every single bolt was over tightened and I just wasn't having any good luck while doing this part of the job. Everything is extremely tight under there, and there's just no good way of doing it. So you just saw me break one of the 3 bolts that are needed to be removed to pull the control arm, and that was the easiest one to get to. The second one that's tucked into the frame a little bit more is nearly impossible to get to, and that is why I had to use the bottle jack to push the control arm up into this position that allowed me to get a socket onto the bolt. This still wasn't very easy to do after I got it in the correct position. This thing was so tight that even with this extension I was not able to break it free, but I end up realizing I could move the socket wrench over just like I broke the first one free, and it gave me a little bit more room to work and a little bit more leverage. But you could see how hard I'm trying to break it free in this position. It just would not happen. So this is where you're going to want to put the wrench if you're trying to do this job at home, and you could probably use a breaker bar, but I like this 1/2" flex head ratchet. It tends to always do the job for me, and it's a little bit more easy to work into places. Now this is where I make the big mistake while I'm doing this job. You do not want to pull this bolt before you pull the other 2 that we already broke free. The reason for that is because I still have the control arm jacked up on the bottle jack, and when I remove this bolt, it will allow the control arm to swing and rotate because I have the other 2 loosened. So I think it would be a better idea to pull the other 2 bolts and then remove this one after you had lowered the bottle jack. I'm not sure because that's not how I did it, but if you're trying to do this yourself, I would do it the opposite way and remove the 2 and then this bolt. You're going to see right here, I go to remove the 2 bolts again, and when I remove the very first one I broke free, I kind of jounce the car forward a little bit, and it totally swings the control arm, and that knocks it off the bottle jack, and the floor jack rolls forward too. Luckily I didn't get too hurt here. I did end up with a couple bruises, and the car wasn't hurt either. But this could have ended so much worse. I got extremely lucky that I really didn't get hurt and the car didn't get damaged. So make sure if you're going to do this job, use jack stands and just take your time doing the work. Now that all the bolts are pulled, I was able to knock the control arm back out of the hub and really wiggle this thing out, and it came free for me, and we had our control arm.
Yo, for real, when the 98 Impreza that's rusted like it was under the sea comes apart easier than your 2017 Nissan, you got to think to yourself, why do they do this to us? All right, so here we have our press.
So this step of the video took much longer than what I'm showing you guys. For me to be able to find a position where the ball joint would be pushed out of the control arm was extremely difficult. There was no good way to put this in the press, and I had to find scrap metal to mount the control arm up to give the proper space for the ball joint to be pushed out of its place. I went and grabbed my dad because I needed like 4 or 5 hands to get this job done.
Go ahead and try it. Oh, it's loose.
Loose?
It came loose, I think. Yeah.
So unfortunately my camera cut the video, but I was able to hit the ball joint with a hammer and it popped right out of the control arm. Now I'm just showing you guys a side by side of the new ball joint and the old ball joint that we removed from the control arm. Now this is a C-clamp that sometimes you're able to use on the car, but there was no room for it while I was trying to remove it. So we just decided to use it to press the ball joint back in rather than using the press, because like I said earlier, it was extremely difficult to use the press and knock the ball joint out. I probably could have used this C-clamp to push the ball joint out of the control arm, but I think the press was a little easier for that aspect. Once we had this thing torqued down, it was flush and the ball joint was pressed into the control arm. We grabbed the new snap ring and I go ahead and put that on the ball joint, so then it's all installed on the control arm. And now it's going to be time to reinstall the control arm back on the vehicle, and this was also not so simple. If you were to ask me, I would say this job is probably like a 7 out of 10. There was nothing easy about it, and generally some ball joints go so much smoother, but this one just happened to give me a headache the entire time I worked on it. So the first thing I did was set the control arm back in the vehicle, and then I pound the ball joint into the hub assembly. I used the bottle jack to kind of push it up the rest of the way that it needed to go, and I go ahead and thread the bolt back in so it holds the ball joint into the hub assembly. I go ahead and throw the bolt in, so this way there's no chance the control arm and the ball joint slip out of the hub assembly, and this way it's kind of mounted on the vehicle. Next we have to get the control arm to seat back in its place on the frame of the vehicle, and this happened to be one of the more difficult parts of the entire job. So in order to get this bushing back in the engine frame, I had to pry it with my pry bar just enough to get it seated in place. I kind of hit it with my hand, and I still play with the pry bar and then hit it with the hammer to try and just get it a little deeper. I really wasn't very gentle with this. I pried pretty hard and I hit it with the hammer pretty decent, so don't be afraid to give it a whack if you need to. Just get it where it needs to be. The rubber bushing is movable, but once you get it close enough, you can get something inside of the hole and that holds it into place. But then I go ahead, I get this little extension in there and I hit this to kind of twist the bushing the way it needs to go. And as you see right there, the extension kind of fell into its place and it's a little bit straightened out the way it needs to be. Now I use the screwdriver to get in the bottom side of it and straighten out the bottom side. Now that we're in the correct position, we can go ahead and slide our bolt in and wiggle it around until we're able to thread it completely through the frame. And just like that, it goes through, and we're going to go ahead and put our nut on it just so that it doesn't fall back through and we don't have to do this process over again. Now these two bolts that go in this part of the frame are kind of difficult to get started. You have to move the control arm around, and once you get them in, you have to hold from behind. There's a set nut in the frame, and it feels like you're able to start threading them by hand, but until you hold the nut from behind, because it's not welded to the frame, it's just set in a piece of the frame that's holding it still. You have to hold it from the backside, and then you're able to finger tighten it in. Then you grab your wrench and go ahead and tighten them up. But this part of the job also took me a little longer than the video shows to figure out, because I would just continuously thread them and they were not tightening. I didn't understand why until I got under the car and saw that I had to hold the bolts, or the nuts for the bolts. Then I go ahead and tighten this last one on because I know we're not going to move the control arm much more. Grab my box wrench and just use my impact to do all the work, zip it right on, and then it was time to tighten up the actual ball joint bolt itself, because we left all this loose just in case I needed to pull it down and move the control arm. It's time to put the tire on and see if this thing is a little tighter than it was when we started. Before we wrap up this video, I just wanted to say thank you so much for watching. Your support means everything to me. Make sure to give me a thumbs up on this video so it reaches a wider audience, and leave me some comments in the section below if you have any questions about the job that we just did. And if anybody was wondering, we made it to Florida with 0 issues. The ball joint seemed much better than it was. Thank you so much for watching one last time, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out.